Transcribed by TurboScribe.ai. Go unlimited to remove this message. It was nearly midnight when I heard the knock on my door. At first, I thought I had imagined it. Who would be visiting at this hour? I was alone in my quiet apartment. The hum of the refrigerator, the only sound accompanying the ticking of the clock. But then, the knock came again, louder this time, and it sent a chill down my spine. I hesitated, unsure whether to answer. When I opened the door, I was surprised to see my neighbor's son, Eric, standing there. He was just a teenager, maybe 15 or 16, and he looked nervous, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. His hands were stuffed into the pockets of his hoodie, and his face was pale, illuminated by the faint glow of the hallway light. Eric wasn't someone I interacted with often, just the occasional wave or polite hello in passing. So, to see him standing on my doorstep in the middle of the night was, to say the least, unexpected. "Hey, is everything okay?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm, though my mind was racing with questions. Why was he here? Did something happen to his family? He hesitated, glancing over his shoulder, as if checking to see if someone was watching. I need your help," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. That's when I noticed the urgency in his eyes. It wasn't just nervousness, it was fear. Whatever brought him to my door at this hour wasn't trivial. I stepped aside, gesturing for him to come in, but he shook his head firmly. "No, I can't stay long," he said quickly. "I just need you to promise me something." His words hung in the air, heavy and uncertain. My curiosity and concern grew stronger. "What is it, Eric? What do you need?" He hesitated again, as if struggling to find the right words or debating whether to even say them at all. Finally, he took a deep breath and said something that left me stunned, a request I never saw coming. And just like that, my quiet evening turned into a night I would never forget. Eric's words caught me completely off guard. "Promise me you won't tell anyone," he said, his voice trembling. His eyes darted around nervously, as if he were afraid someone might overhear. I didn't know how to respond. The weight of his request hung between us, and I could feel the tension in the air. "Eric," I said carefully, "I can't promise anything unless I know what's going on. Are you in trouble?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced down at his feet, his shoulders slumping like he was carrying the weight of the world. For a moment, I thought he might just turn around and walk away, leaving me with nothing but questions. But then he looked up, his expression a mix of desperation and determination. "It's not about me," he said finally. It's someone else. I can't explain everything right now, but I just need to know I can trust you. Please." His words only added to the confusion swirling in my head. Someone else? What could possibly be so serious that he'd show up at my door in the middle of the night? And why couldn't he tell me the full story? Still, I could see how much it had taken for him to come here. Whatever this was, it mattered to him. "I'll listen," I said softly, trying to reassure him. "But you've got to give me something to work with, Eric. I can't help you if I don't understand." He hesitated again, running a hand through his messy hair. "It's about my dad," he said finally, almost in a whisper. The way he said it made my chest tighten. His dad, Mr. Collins, was a no-nonsense kind of guy, strict, but not someone I'd ever imagined could be at the center of anything troubling. "What about your dad?" I asked, my voice barely audible now. Eric looked at me, his eyes brimming with emotion. "He's hiding something big, and if anyone finds out, it's going to ruin everything." I opened my mouth to ask more, but he shook his head quickly. "That's all I can say right now, just please don't say anything. Not to him, not to anyone." And with that, He turned and walked away, leaving me frozen in the doorway, wondering what I'd just gotten myself into. As Eric disappeared down the hallway, I stood there for a moment, trying to make sense of what had just happened. My mind raced with possibilities, each one more unsettling than the last. What could Mr. Collins, the reserved and seemingly upstanding man next door, possibly be hiding? And why would Eric feel compelled to involve me? The more I thought about it, the more uneasy I became. Something about the whole situation felt off, like a puzzle with too many missing pieces. I closed the door and locked it, leaning against it as I replayed Eric's words in my mind. He's hiding something. What did that even mean? A secret at work? Family troubles? My curiosity was pulling me in, but at the same time, I couldn't shake the feeling that getting involved might be a mistake. Still, how could I ignore it now? Eric had come to me, of all people, for help. There had to be a reason. The next day, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Every time I passed Mr. Collins in the hallway or saw him from my window, I found myself analyzing his every move. Did he seem tense? Was he acting differently? Or was I just imagining things because of what Eric had said? That evening, I noticed something strange. Mr. Collins usually came home from work at the same time every day, but tonight, his car wasn't in the driveway. Hours passed, and still no sign of him. I told myself it wasn't unusual. People run errands, have plans. But when I saw Eric standing by his window, staring out into the dark, I knew I wasn't the only one wondering where he was. What could Mr. Collins be up to, and how much of it had to do with Eric's cryptic warning? The questions kept piling up, and I had no answers. Only a growing sense that I was on the verge of discovering something I might not be ready to face. The unease only grew as the hours ticked by. It was well past midnight when I finally spotted movement outside. I peered out through the curtains, just in time to see Mr. Collins pulling into the driveway. His car lights cut through the darkness as he stepped out, glancing around as if checking to see if anyone was watching. There was something strange about the way he moved. Hurried, almost frantic. He was carrying a large duffel bag slung over his shoulder, the kind you'd take to the gym or on a weekend trip, but it looked heavy, weighed down by something I couldn't identify. I couldn't tear my eyes away. He didn't head straight for his house. Instead, he walked around to the side, disappearing into the shadows. My heart raced. What was he doing? And why did it feel like he didn't want anyone to see him? I debated whether to text Eric, but something held me back. If Mr. Collins was hiding something, would Eric even want me to know more? Or had he already said too much? Before I could make a decision, I noticed something even more unsettling. Eric was outside too. I hadn't seen him leave his house, but there he was, crouched near the bushes, watching his dad's every move. What was Eric doing out there in the middle of the night? And why did it feel like they were both caught in some kind of unspoken game, circling each other in the dark? My curiosity burned, but so did my fear. Then, out of nowhere, Mr. Collins stopped. He turned abruptly, scanning the yard, like he'd sensed something, or someone, watching him. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. What would happen if he saw Eric? Or worse, if he saw me? I stood completely still, my heart pounding as Mr. Collins scanned the yard. His movements were sharp, deliberate, like he was hunting for something or someone. Eric, still crouched in the shadows near the bushes, didn't move a muscle. I held my breath, silently willing him to stay hidden. For a moment, it seemed like Mr. Collins might shrug it off and go inside, but then he did something that made my stomach twist. He reached into his duffel bag and pulled out a flashlight. The beam of light cut through the dark, sweeping across the yard and bushes. My pulse quickened as it inched closer to where Eric was hiding. I clenched my fists, torn between the urge to stay put and the instinct to do something, anything, to protect Eric. But what could I do? If I intervened now, I'd blow whatever fragile trust Eric had placed in me, and maybe put myself in harm's way. Just as the flashlight beam grazed the bushes, a loud clatter broke the silence. It came from the far end of the yard, near the trash cans. Mr. Collins whipped around, his flashlight darting toward the noise. Eric seized the moment, quietly retreating further into the shadows while his father's attention was diverted. I squinted, trying to see what caused the noise, and that's when I spotted it, a figure slipping away into the darkness. It wasn't Eric or Mr. Collins, it was someone else. My chest tightened. Who was out there, and how were they connected to whatever was happening? Mr. Collins muttered something under his breath and started toward the noise, his flashlight bouncing with each step. His duffel bag remained on the ground, abandoned for now. My eyes flicked between him and the bag, a new sense of dread creeping in. If there was a second person involved, this wasn't just about family secrets anymore. It was bigger, darker. Eric, to my relief, slipped back toward the house unnoticed. I watched as he crept up the back steps and ducked inside, his movements quick and silent. I didn't know whether to follow him or stay at my window to see how this unfolded. Part of me wanted answers, but another part of me was afraid of what I might discover. As Mr. Collins disappeared around the corner, I decided to act. I couldn't ignore the duffel bag sitting out in the open. It felt like a clue, something that could unravel whatever was happening here. My hands shook as I opened my door and stepped into the cool night air, my footsteps light against the pavement. I glanced around, making sure the coast was clear before crouching next to the bag. The zipper was partially open, just enough for me to catch a glimpse of what was inside. My stomach dropped. It wasn't gym clothes or anything innocent. There were documents, papers that looked official, some stamped with bold red letters, and something wrapped in cloth. I didn't dare touch it, but my mind was already racing with possibilities. Evidence, money, something worse. Before I could think further, I heard the crunch of footsteps on the gravel behind me. My heart leapt into my throat as I spun around, my breath catching when I saw who was standing there. It wasn't Mr. Collins. It was Eric, his face pale and his expression unreadable. "You shouldn't be out here," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of my pounding heart. "He'll be back any second." "What is this, Eric?" I asked, gesturing toward the bag. "What's going on?" He hesitated, his jaw tightening. "It's not safe for you to know," he said finally, his voice trembling. "But you've seen too much now. You can't get out of this anymore." Eric's words hit me like a brick. "You can't get out of this anymore." My heart raced as I stared at him, his pale face illuminated by the faint glow from the porch light. "What do you mean?" "Eric, you need to tell me what's going on," I said, my voice shaky but firm. Before he could respond, the sound of footsteps returned, this time faster and closer. Mr. Collins was coming back. Eric's eyes widened in panic, and he grabbed my arm, pulling me toward the side of the house. "Hide," he whispered harshly. I didn't have time to argue. We crouched behind the thick shrubs, the duffel bag still sitting in the open yard like a ticking time bomb. Mr. Collins appeared a moment later, his flashlight sweeping the area again. He froze when he saw the bag, his expression hardening. "Damn it," he muttered under his breath, quickly grabbing it and slinging it over his shoulder. But instead of going inside, he headed toward the street. Eric tensed beside me, his grip on my arm tightening. "We have to follow him," Eric whispered, his voice urgent. This is our only chance to find out the truth. Against my better judgment, I nodded. Staying in the shadows, we trailed Mr. Collins as he walked down the dimly lit street. He stopped at an old abandoned building at the end of the block and disappeared inside. My heart pounded as we crept closer, peeking through a cracked window. Inside, Mr. Collins was unpacking the duffel bag. The papers spilled out onto a dusty table, and I caught glimpses of what looked like financial records and legal documents. But it was what he unwrapped from the cloth that made my blood run cold. It was a gun. Eric's breath hitched beside me, and I turned to him. Eric, what is this? What is he doing? Eric's face was pale, his voice trembling, as he finally answered. My dad, he's been working with someone dangerous. He said it was to protect the family, but I think he's in way over his head. Before I could respond, another figure stepped into the room, a man I didn't recognize. They exchanged tense words, but then the stranger pulled out his own gun, aiming it at Mr. Collins. My chest tightened as I realized this wasn't just about secrets, it was a confrontation, and it was about to go horribly wrong. Just as the tension reached its breaking point, Eric stood up. "Dad, stop!" he shouted, bursting through the door. My instinct was to grab him, but it was too late. The room exploded into chaos, and in the confusion, I saw Mr. Collins shove the stranger's arm aside, the gun firing into the wall. When it was over, the stranger was gone, and Mr. Collins stood there, shaken but unharmed. He looked at Eric, his expression a mix of anger and relief. "You shouldn't have come here," he said. The final twist came when Mr. Collins turned to me. "And you," he said, his voice cold, "you've seen too much." Mr. Collins's words sent a chill down my spine. "You've seen too much," he repeated, his voice hard but edged with something else. Fear. I stood frozen, unsure of what to say or do. Eric stepped in front of me, shielding me from his father's glare. "It's not her fault," he said firmly. "She didn't ask to be dragged into this." For a moment, Mr. Collins didn't respond. He looked between us, the weight of the situation etched into his face. Finally, he exhaled deeply, his shoulders slumping. The tension in the room shifted, though the air still felt heavy with unspoken truths. "I didn't want you to know," he said, directing his words at Eric. "I was trying to fix this, to keep you safe." Eric shook his head, his voice breaking. "Safe? By doing what? Getting involved with dangerous people, hiding things from me, from everyone." His frustration was raw, and it was clear this wasn't the first time he had felt this way. Mr. Collins sat down heavily at the table, rubbing his temples. "It wasn't supposed to go this far," he admitted. "I made a deal to cover some debts, to protect the house, the family, but they kept asking for more. I thought I could handle it on my own." The gravity of his confession hung in the air. Suddenly, everything made sense. The late nights, the secrecy, Eric's desperation to involve me. Mr. Collins wasn't a bad man. He was a desperate one, caught in a web he couldn't untangle. Eric's voice softened, though his anger hadn't fully faded. "You should have told me. We could have faced this together." Mr. Collins looked up at his son, a flicker of regret in his eyes. "I didn't want you to get hurt," he said. "But I see now that keeping you in the dark only made things worse." At that moment, the sound of distant sirens broke the silence. Mr. Collins nodded, almost as if he'd been expecting it. "I called them before I came here," he said quietly. "I told them everything. It's over now." The relief on Eric's face was immediate, though it was mixed with sadness. As the police arrived and the stranger's role in all of this began to unravel, I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of closure. The secrets, the lies, the danger. It was all out in the open now. In the end, Eric and I walked away from that night forever changed. His family would have to rebuild, and I knew it wouldn't be easy. But as we stood on the quiet street, watching the flashing lights fade into the distance, I realized that sometimes the truth, no matter how painful, is the first step toward healing. And in that moment, I knew we'd all find a way to move forward.